Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Gretchen, and I'm joined here with my co-hosts, JM and Nate. How are you both doing tonight?
Hey, doing good.
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
Definitely been a weird couple weeks for me. I've been isolating from COVID, unfortunately, and it's...
Oh, no. So that's what you had?
Yeah, it turned out to be what I had, yeah. But my wife doesn't have it, so we've been kind of separated from one another in different parts of the apartment. It's kind of been a weird experience, but it's nice to have some human contact tonight talking, well, not about a regular order of business, but a little bit of diversion and I guess talking about some of the stories we've done on the podcast previously and other things that we've done in the last month. And don't worry, we'll be getting to our regular stories that we announced last time in a week or so. So we just wanted to put out some additional content for you this month.
Sounds good. I've been, working and dealing with some personal issues, but it's been a bit of a complicated year, but I don't know. It's not looking too bad right now. Happy to be doing this sort of relaxed edition of Chrononauts where we talk about the last couple of years, because it's actually been a while since we did any kind of bonus run through of everything we've been doing. I don't want to convey the impression that, we forget about these stories after we talk about them. Some of them stick in our heads, and I think that's one of the good things about doing this, is that we get to come revisit something from the past year or two and just talk about, what do we think about it now, and so on, and what are we going to do in the future?
Yes. Looking over all of the stories that we've read, like in the past, year and a half or so.
Yeah, it's certainly an even time period or an even number of stories. But yeah, pretty much everything starting with Kindred, maybe, I don't know, it's been like 15 episodes or so since then, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah, fair amount of stories.
Yeah. It was really difficult, I will say, looking at some of the stories to choose. But I've also been doing pretty well. I have been pretty busy with courses my last year of university. So I'm already up to midterms, which is crazy to think about. I don't know exactly what happened in the last few months, but it's been a very enjoyable time, though. I've definitely enjoyed the classes that I'm taking this semester.
And Nate, you saw a couple of pretty good, interesting gigs lately, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. I saw Sabat play in, I guess technically Queens. It's right over the line from Brooklyn on Sunday, and then Sodom play on last Wednesday, which was a band I've never seen before. I've seen Sabat like 20 years ago, but it was cool to have them come around too.
Gretchen, you weren't involved in the last one, but I've had a personal request from my friend Star that we should do another musical episode. And so we did a Voivod one, which we'll name check now because we're probably not going to talk about it when we talk about the stories, but that was a pretty fun little diversion that Nate and I got up to last year. And yeah, I do remember that Sodom gig from 20 years ago as well. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think the lineup is different now. Frank Blackfire is still in the band, right?
Yeah, he is, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, it was pretty cool to see. They played for a really long time. Yeah, I've been pretty much posted up at home since, so yeah, it's been a weird couple weeks, definitely. But
yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah. Hopefully it goes away.
At least you didn't have to miss the concerts. That's good.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. At least you got to see that before COVID struck.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I have King Diamond coming up in a couple weeks, so hopefully the COVID goes away by that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, before we get into what we're talking about tonight, you can find us on all the regular podcasting platforms of Apple and Google and Spotify, and we're also on YouTube. And we have a blog spot at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com where you can check out hard to find and original translations of stories. And we'll be posting some stuff on there at some point in the future, so stay tuned and check that out. And you can also follow us on Twitter at ChrononautsSF or on Facebook.com/ChrononautsPodcast. Or email us at chrononautspodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, I always forget to bring that up too. We have to plug our pluggables because otherwise people won't know where to find us, right? So
I guess why don't we talk about what we've been reading, not for the podcast, in the last month or so? I'm sure there's a fair amount of interesting stuff that we've all been up to.
Yeah.
I didn't read as much as I did last time because I think last time I was kind of the sick one, and so I did a lot of reading during that period. I've done a little less this time, but I've still been reading some stuff. But I don't know. I think I went first last time, so why don't you guys go first?
Well, I have been doing a lot of interesting readings for classes. Two of the courses that I'm taking recently are medieval women writers and like a Renaissance class, and it's been really interesting. The last thing we read for my medieval class was Marie de France. We read some of her like fables and her lays, as they're called, which were really interesting.
Yeah, I've read
I really
those.
liked reading those. Yeah,
those are
they
cool.
were really great.
That one about the guy who only turns into a werewolf when he's not wearing clothes or something like that. Yeah,
yeah, that one we have to write like a paper every class, like a short thing about like one of the like passages, and I wrote about that one because I thought that was a really cool story.
It is, yeah. I had some. I think it was a Penguin edition, one of those mass market ones. I had a couple of them in dual language form with the medieval French on one side and then the English on the other.
Nice. Yeah, we have a couple of those copies for the readings that we've been doing. We read Roswitha, who is this German, I think she's considered one of the first like German playwrights. And it was really interesting. Usually like single act plays, those are really cool. Mm-hmm. And for my Renaissance class, the current thing we're reading is another play, and it's actually Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which is my first experience with Marlowe.
Cool.
So I'm really enjoying that. Outside of courses, I have done a little bit of extra reading. I started reading for, October for Halloween. I had this book of medieval ghost stories that I thought went well with my medieval course. So I've been reading those. And I know JM will also mention this, but the yearly tradition of reading A Night in the Lonesome October has started. I didn't have my copy with me on campus, but now that I have, I'm kind of making up the days that I missed. And we'll hopefully reach the current day soon. I'm hoping to read a little bit more of that for the coming weekend.
Yeah, still have to read that. I'll have to check that out at some point.
It's a really cool book.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so in addition to the stuff that I read since last time, I also wanted to mention two different bookstores that I've been to since last time. The first is the Family Bookshop in DeLand, Florida, and unfortunately their shop got damaged by Hurricane Milton. So if you live in the Central Florida area, I'm sure they would appreciate any business while they get back on their feet. I visited a few months ago before the hurricane, and I'd been there prior, and I'm consistently impressed at how good their selection is, where it's a wide selection of titles at reasonable prices, and if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you'll know that I regularly read classics, and I could have walked away with boxes and boxes of stuff from their classics section, mostly at like $3 to $5 per paperback, but they also have a very large science fiction section where I purchased Frederick Pohl's Gateway, an anthology of the C.L. Moore Northwest Smith stories, 2 Abraham Merritt novels, but like the classics section, I could have easily walked out with boxes and boxes of stuff. As one of the best parts of the store is that it is meticulously organized and not just like a bunch of books shoved every which way everywhere, so you can find stuff in a reasonable amount of time. And if you're in the area, it's definitely worth a visit. The other bookstore I want to talk about is a little bit closer to home, which is RBC Books in Brooklyn. In Brighton Beach, the largest Russian-speaking neighborhood in New York. We've talked about Russian science fiction on the podcast before, and I wanted to try to find something here. And was definitely impressed at their selection. All the books are in Russian, so if you don't have any familiarity with the language, it might be less interest of a place to you, but they had a massive selection of not only the 19th century literary greats like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, but also a huge Russian science fiction fantasy section with the Strugatsky brothers having their own wall. For science fiction stuff, I got an edition of Hard to Be a God, as well as an anthology of a bunch of stuff that includes Roadside Picnic, as well as Alexei Tolstoy's Alita, all of which I'd like to cover on the podcast someday, so it'll be neat to have a print version of the Russian language version to compare to the English translations when we do those.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So for stuff that I've read since last time, I read the first volume of Livy, who was a Roman historian who lived between 59 BC and 17 AD. He wrote a massive work that consisted of 142 books, and like much of the ancient world, not all of it survives. Only 35 of those books do, namely 1 through 10 and 21 to 45. The volume I read was the first 5 books, which starts from the mythical settlement of the area from refugees fleeing Troy, which is a story you get in the Aeneid by Virgil, written around this time, going to the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BC. And while Livy is a bit of a dry writer, a lot of the format is in year X, this happened, and then in the next year, this happened. But like all the ancient writers, he was one of the few surviving lenses we have to look into this stuff, as much of the sources that Livy relies on and comments on are themselves lost. So it's just a unique portal into another world. Also, from roughly around the same time, I read the poems of Catullus, who lived from 84 BC to 54 BC. Dying quite young, a little bit before Livy started writing, but their lives overlapped by a few years, so they could be considered somewhat contemporary of one another. And this provides another look into ancient society, aside from the historians, in that we see a much more human element, the messy love affairs, the dirty jokes. There's a lot in here that feels incredibly modern in its sentiment, which is always fascinating to see in these ancient texts. There's a lot of translations of this, apparently. I read the Horace Gregory translation, which prints some of the poems side by side in Latin and English, and Gregory definitely does a lot of breaking of these lines in order to get them into English. Poetry certainly presents a near impossible translation challenge, especially in a language like Latin, which will feel falsely close to English due to the vocabulary, but its case system will really pose any serious problems if trying at all to preserve things like rhyme or meter. I also read Persuasion by Jane Austen. I'm not really a huge Jane Austen fan, so apologies to listeners who are. I previously read Pride and Prejudice, Emma, and Northanger Abbey, and while I never really got into any of them, I think they're all relatively pleasant and mildly amusing at times. I can certainly appreciate her commentary on gender and society, but as novels, I don't know, it just doesn't work for me a lot of the time. I still do have Mansfield Park and Sensibility on my shelf, so I'll get to those at some point.
Yeah, I didn't really have a great time trying to read Austen in my early 20s, but I'm not sure about now.
Yeah.
Let's give another try.
So far, I've only read Pride and Prejudice and Emma, although I read them in high school. I don't know, maybe I would prefer, enjoy them a little bit more if I revisited them. I would like to try out some of the other novels that she wrote.
Yeah, the version Clueless of Emma, the 90s comedy, is pretty funny.
Yeah, that's a good film.
And there are some parts of Northanger Abbey where she does a satire of Gothic novels.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about an early satire of Gothic novels and how that would read.
But I don't know, she doesn't really lay into it as hard as she could have. So I don't know. I wanted to like it more than I did, but again, it wasn't bad. I wouldn't say Jane Austen is bad, but I pretty much prefer every other 19th century British author that I've read, so yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
After that, I read The Summer of Katya by Trevanian. I'd previously read the Iyer sanctioned Shibumi.
I read that a few years ago. That was an interesting one. Yeah. What do you think of that one?
Yeah, it was. So, I mean, all the stuff I'd read previously by him were these comic genre entries that were not really parody, but probably close to as you can get to parody without it being parody, I guess. This one definitely felt like he was trying to do more of a Balzac type story, despite the fact that it's set prior to World War I. And I don't know, it feels a little bit anachronistic in the way the characters talk to one another and interact with one another, and didn't quite work as well for me as the more outright satirical stuff. I did like it, but it wasn't my favorite out of his. I thought it was going to be building up to one of my least favorite tropes, but thankfully avoids it, so crisis avoided. But
yeah, I thought Song of Katya was going to be very different than it was, too.
Yeah, I didn't mind it. I thought it was decent, but yeah, I don't know. I like his more spy fiction.
His more funny books?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I haven't read any of those, and I cheated. I did this thing where, I remember one time, somebody who was really into film and was really into, what was the subject? I think it was Ingmar Bergman or something like that. Mm-hmm. And she was telling my former wife, they were talking about films of and I think she said something about everybody wants to watch Hour of the Wolf because it's like Ingmar Bergman's horror movie-ish, right? And she's like, don't watch Hour of the Wolf first. Whatever you do, please don't. So I'm picking this novel from Trevanian that's totally atypical of everything that he does. And that's kind of the reason why I picked it. And I'm like, I don't know. I guess I was still somewhat misled because I thought it was going to be this really gothic novel or something like that, and it's not at all.
No.
I actually quite enjoyed it because I could tell that something momentous and bad was going to happen at the end, but it was it was weird because my sense of anticipation builded, and then I was like, wait, I'm very close to the end of the book now.
Yeah.
Almost nothing has happened. So, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting, though. It was well written. I kind of enjoyed reading it, but it was just a weird experience because, it wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't typical of him, and it also kind of led me down the garden path expecting something that was, like, I don't know, going to be big and momentous. And, it kind of happened in the last few pages, like, the something that was being built up to finally did happen. But, I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting. I'd read more, though, for sure. Do you recommend Shibumi or something?
Oh, yeah. Shibumi is another one where he gets a lot into the Basque people and culture, too. So that element is very much present in The Summer of Katya, which I think is a fascinating little cultural and linguistic area of the world. Yeah, Shibumi and Eiger Sanction and Incident at 20 Mile I thought were all really fun. Various degrees of ridiculousness, but yeah.
I've seen the movie Eiger Sanction.
Oh yeah, Trevanian. I've never seen the movie, but apparently Trevanian hated the movie and thought it was watered down. And
there's also a pretty good radio play made by the BBC that was pretty good as well.
So in addition to that, I also read The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. And I was especially looking forward to that one, as it's one of the things that Frankenstein's creature reads when posted up in the cabin. Mm-hmm. And I can definitely see it affecting the creature's mind very much, as this is extremely moody stuff. And given how early it is from 1774, it's pretty easy seeing it as an influence on a lot of later writers, not just Shelley, but definitely traces of this and a lot of Dostoevsky too. I read Main Street by Lewis and Clare. I previously read Babbitt and enjoyed it, and also liked this one. Pretty well done satirical novel on small town America that I think is more interesting for its historical snapshot of the changing technologies and modernization of America around 1910s and 1920s. But like Babbitt, managed to be somewhat light reading while very effective satire. So recommended if you're into that kind of thing. I also read an anthology of Russian science fiction. It's called Russian Science Fiction 1969, which is kind of a misnomer, as it does have some stories from the 1950s in it, but a few of these have appeared elsewhere in other translations. Others, this is the only version translated into English, and the translations themselves are definitely a mixed bag. Some are adequate and some are far less than ideal, which certainly gives me a little bit more confidence as a translator doing our amateur stuff, and that I could say that I would have done a better job on some of these. But I would like to cover a couple pieces later down the road, and there's an abridged version of the novella, The Minotaur, at the end, which chops out about a third of the text. So years down the line, after I finish up what I want to do with Latin American, Italian stories, I'll probably translate the abridged parts and post it on the blog spot, as it's a weird but interesting story. Just before this recording, I finished up The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker by Tobias Smollett, which is a 18th century comic novel told through 5 different point of view characters through the letters that they're writing to various correspondents and acquaintances of theirs. And the recipients of these letters, which are largely consistent for each of the correspondent, are all different from one another. They're not really characters in the novel themselves, but their personalities can be felt indirectly. And it's a pretty cool method of storytelling. I think greatly enhances what is more or less a standard 18th century travelogue picaresque type plot. And as far as 18th century comedies go, I didn't quite like it as much as Henry Fielding's Tom Jones or Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, both of which I think are like all-time comic masterpieces of the English language. I still thought this one was pretty good. In addition to the social satire, it gives you a nice look at the towns all around Great Britain, as well as the roads and the technology linking them and allowing them to travel to the towns and in various inns and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. And I'm about halfway through the short story collection A Curtain of Green and Other Stories by Eudora Welty, who is a Southern Gothic author. I'd previously read her novel, The Optimist's Daughter, which I thought was pretty good. And she's incredibly effective in short story format, more unsettling and unnerving rather than being like over the top, exceptionally dark and morbid like Faulkner. But out of the stories I've read so far, Why I Live at the Post Office is the absolute standout, just like a total masterpiece. And I'm certainly looking forward to finishing the collection.
That one I have read for a previous course, and that is a great story.
That's so good.
I've been meaning to read. I do have a copy of The Optimist's Daughter, but I haven't read it myself yet.
It's a really quick read, man. It's a kind of a downbeat story, but it's definitely good, and I'm definitely curious to read more of her stuff.
Yeah, I've been curious about that one, definitely.
Yeah, especially as a Southern Gothic fan myself. I love that genre, so I'm definitely interested in more of her work.
Yeah, she's good at it. I'm definitely looking forward to the rest of the collection, and she's got a couple other short story collections too, which sound good as well. So, yeah, that's what I've been up to. It's a fair amount of stuff, but yeah, I think all pretty good.
Cool, yeah. So, like I said, it's not been quite reading as much, but a little bit of cool stuff. A lot of it sort of genre related, so possibly podcast related, possibly not. So, last year, I introduced myself around this time. We're doing this episode in October, and everybody calls this the spooky season now. So, never heard that expression until recently, but that's now the whole month of October. Everybody thinks it's cool to watch and read horror stories and stuff like that. And of course, I can do that all year round, but it's also kind of fun to revisit some old favorites. So, yeah. A Night in the Lonesome October by Zelazny. Movies like The Beyond and Night of the Demon, the 1950s one based on the M.R. James story. I've been reading more, another collection of R. Chetwynd Hayes stories. Last year was kind of really getting into him around this time as well. Really cool. I don't know, I kind of think about him as almost like the pre-Clive Barker. Like, he's another Englishman from, I guess, the previous generation who a lot of his stuff is kind of traditional ghost story almost, but he also puts a bit of a twist on it, and he seems to really sympathize with monsters and all the monsters' creations and stuff like that. He thinks they should all form a society where they help each other. So that's kind of cool. Yeah. Sometimes the stories get dark and sad, but they're generally not that heavy. It's kind of the stuff that I think that people who don't generally read horror could still enjoy, but that's not putting it down and saying that it's like not as good. It's kind of appeals to, it's not necessarily trying to be totally dark and scary all the time, I guess. It's kind of, some of the stories have almost a positive feeling to them, even though they're dealing with macabre subject matters and stuff. Contrast to that, though, I discovered an Hungarian author named Attila Veres. I think that's how you pronounce the last name. Possibly a Hungarian person could correct me. But he has a translated collection from a couple of years ago called The Black Maybe and Other Liminal Tales. And yeah, those stories are really dark and weird. I think Thomas Ligotti, H.P. Lovecraft, lots of body horror, lots of, I guess, things you might want to be wary of, like self-harm and mutilation if you're of a certain disposition. Wants to be careful about what you might be opening up when you open that can of worms. But I like the stories. They're pretty cool. There's strange bits of humor interlacing them, and they are modern stories, so they do make use of certain things. Like one story is written in the form of an internet travel review to a very, very strange country. And there's another story about a boy who grows up in a village somewhere in Eastern Europe and has a weird obsession with plush toys. And there's all this weird familial stuff going on, and I guess you could say guilt and trauma from childhood and stuff like that. So yeah, that's a bit more heavy reading, definitely, than R. Chetwynd Hayes. I don't know if I quite like him as much, but I'm getting into the stories. I've read about maybe half the collection so far. I did read a longer work. Well, I've actually not finished it yet because I've been taking so many detours, but I've been reading a book by a writer named Bryce Courtney, who's I guess he was one of the best-selling authors in Australia, but I never heard about him until recently. The book is called Jessica, and it's about a girl who's growing up in the backwoods of Australia in the early 1910s and encounters not a very good situation. I guess there's some reminiscences to other things that I've read. Like, at points I was reminded a little bit of Steinbeck's Mice and Men, but this is a much longer work, and it's much more, I don't know, it's much more like just really going into what life was like for somebody living in that area at that time who doesn't really fit in with society and who basically does all the work that everybody thinks a man should do, and they don't respect her, and the women don't like her, and the men don't respect her, and she just wants to be like, she wants to do her thing, and she's also discovering herself. And it's an unusual thing for me because it definitely feels quite, I guess, mainstream in terms of it doesn't have any, it's not an old classic, it's not a genre book or anything like that. But yeah, every so often I like to try different stuff. I used to get a lot of contemporary books in my old job, and sometimes I would read them, and, it's just, like, some of them are pretty good. So, yeah, I'm enjoying it quite a lot. It's not an easy read in some senses because, she does go through a lot, and there's a lot of things that's, like, uncomfortable reading, I guess, but he does it very well. He puts, there's a lot of sympathy and a lot of good pathos and stuff, and I don't know, it's definitely been a pretty good read. Also, podcast related, I guess, so when we do these things, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes when I'm really looking into an author background and stuff, I tend to get fascinated by the author, and I want to read more of their stuff than what we have for the podcast, especially if we're just doing short stories. I might read a few more just to get a sense of what they're like and different points in their career and so on. So I read a bunch of stories by Fred Pohl, which I'll talk more about probably when we cover him in a few weeks. I also read a Gerald Kirsch book because not only are we going to be doing him in a couple of weeks as well, but Gretchen and I both watched, it was a rewatch for me, a film based on his book, Night in the City. And that and reading all about him and stuff really got me into, and of course reading The Brighton Monster, which we're going to be covering, got me back into reading more of his stuff. And there's a lot of novels that he wrote, and quite a varied career that will be really fascinating to talk about when we talk about it. But I did read his book, An Ape, a Dog, and a Serpent. A fantastic novel. Definitely interesting, cool. One thing that I noticed right away was that The Wondersmith by Fitzjames O'Brien, although it's never named in the text, is very, very, very directly referenced, as in basically the main character drunkenly comes up with a play. He thinks that he's writing this play, and he's trying to sell it to this he's telling this guy all his crazy ideas, and the play that he comes up with is basically The Wondersmith. Nice. Exactly. And so a lot of Kirsch's stuff has to do with people being, like con men and conning other people and having like jumped up ideas about their weird careers and things that they're doing, like, Harry Fabian in Night in the City. Just this like really extreme character. In the book, he's like utterly irredeemable, but in the movie, he's pretty charming. But Kirsch manages to make these kind of waste characters, like, just are no good to anybody, but he makes them kind of, you can give them a certain charm as well. There's a lot more of that in An Ape, a Dog, and a Serpent, and it's set in the early days of movies. So the game, instead of controlling wrestling, it's films, silent films. So, interesting. So that was pretty cool. I think that's pretty much been the extent of it. I guess that's still a fair bit of reading. Lots of short stories as normal. Kind of do that to unwind from other stuff, and a couple of longer works.
Nice. Awesome.
So before we get into talking a little bit, reminiscing, I suppose, about some of the stories that we've done lately, we might want to talk just briefly about the future, and then also, I guess, a couple of general questions about our experiences over the past year and a half, 2 years, however long it's been. We have a few cool things planned. We definitely are going to be, after we talk about our 3 authors that we brought up last time. Actually, it's 6 authors. After we talk about those, we're going to do an apocalypse-themed series of episodes. We have a lot more translations, which I'll leave Nate to talk about if you want to talk a bit about that. We have not only for the apocalypse one, but I think, we also have a Sword and Planet-themed episode coming out. So we're going to be talking about some of the usual suspects, definitely some Edgar Rice Bros. And Leigh Brackett again, I think. So,
yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. And I think with the translations, I've done a fair amount over the last couple of years of the older era, the 19th century stuff, the pre-1926 stuff. But as we move forward, we're going to be taking a look at how science fiction expands globally through, I guess, the influence of the American pulps. And in particular, Galaxy has a pretty big hand to that. But there was a fair amount of activity from Latin America and continental Europe, and I definitely want to take a look at how that manifests itself in those magazines, both from the Spanish language stuff and the Italian stuff, as there is a fair amount from both scenes that I think will be fun to do on the podcast. A couple of the books that I bought in Rome last year that I thought were novels, I just obviously didn't look at the book closely enough, because not only are they novels, but some of them have like 5 short stories tacked on at the end. So I think some of those will be fun to do at some point in time. So yeah, definitely look on the blog spot for more recent stuff that we'll be doing translations of, in addition to the stuff there from the 20s and before that will be filtering in our episodes that we do, I don't know, in the next coming year or so. I think there's a couple more that we want to cover from the previous blog. But yeah, we'll have an opportunity to do that the next time. I think those stories will definitely be interesting discussions, both of the ones that we're going to be taking a look at.
The talk of translations and language maybe is part of the thing that made me really interested in doing a language and linguistics themed Chrononauts series of segments.
Yes.
So actually, definitely, I'm planning that for probably, sometime next year, early next year, maybe we'll be doing that. We'll be covering stuff like Babel 17 from DeLand and The Languages of Pow from Jack Vance. And I think I have an Ursula Le Guin story slotted in there as well. So, yeah, that's going to be, and The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. So we're going to be maybe changing up the format just a little bit, and behind the scenes, that is. In front, you won't really probably notice that much difference, but it should actually help us to get out a few more episodes a bit more regularly. So you can definitely look forward to a lot of stuff starting next month and moving forward into next year. I'm really excited about a lot of the stuff that's coming up. I did want to ask, because this is something that I remember came up last time, or maybe it was the time before that. I think it was last time. I think maybe... Obviously, this is a science fiction literature podcast, so our main focus is fiction, but we do some research and we look into some backgrounds, and sometimes this could be an author background, sometimes this could be something social or scientific. So I guess I'm just wondering, all that stuff that you guys were doing this time around and that we were all doing, what stood out the most to you guys? Like in terms of, I guess, not necessarily book recommendations in terms of nonfiction works, but actual material that you maybe enjoyed looking into, or you found out something interesting that you didn't know before, that kind of thing. Did anything stand out to either of you?
Yeah, quite a bit, actually. The stuff that I'll be talking about next time on early Indian science fiction, I think, was a really interesting rabbit hole to go down. And it was a pretty interesting contrast to the Soviet fiction episode that we did, where, I can read the languages and I'm able to work with the primary documentation, but for next time, I'm just pretty much reliant on the secondary sourcing, of which there's a fair amount, but a lot of it does conflict with one another. So again, it'll be a different kind of presentation, but it's still fascinating rabbit hole nonetheless, because a lot of those stories just sound really, really cool, even though there's a limited amount of stuff that we can cover due to its lack of availability in English.
Cool. Yeah, definitely doing this podcast can take you down some interesting rabbit holes, and that's generally been a great pleasure. Sometimes I'll talk about this a little more going forward. I think this whole batch has been largely really good, so there hasn't been too much unbearable fiction. But let's say the fiction is bad, which can happen from time to time.
Yeah.
Then we have something else to look forward to as well, because we always have some background to talk about, or some, maybe the author had an interesting life or something like that. And,
I will say that when trying to decide on some of the worst for the lists we'll be getting into, I think I was quite lenient sometimes on certain authors, because I was like, well, I thought they were just interesting to look into, that I felt kind of bad putting their story in the worst list. I just was more biased towards them.
Yeah, and I think it's generally good to put a positive spin on some of the stuff that we cover, even if it's not a masterpiece. I don't want to be trash talking everything that we do and come across as super negative, because there's plenty of places on the internet that already do that. So I think there's something valuable in pretty much everything that we've covered so far, even the stuff that I didn't really like doing. It has its time and its place and its role in science fiction history.
For my part, I think in terms of, there were some quite interesting author bios and things to look into that I sort of enjoyed. In some cases, definitely, I guess, when you can find especially something written by the author themselves, and it's a really interesting glimpse into, I guess, not only their lives, but the creative process and so on. So even though, well, it's not going to make my bottom list either, but for example, Lest Darkness Fall by DeCamp, it's not in my top list. And I definitely, reading his autobiography didn't necessarily make me warm to him a ton, But it made me understand him a lot more, and I actually really appreciated that. And it was an interesting read, even if, as a person, he can seem kind of frustrating. And even some of his, like, there's just that offhand comment in the Novella Lee book about Astounding about how Leon DeCap tended to annoy people. And it's not qualified or anything. It's just like, okay. I guess this is just common knowledge. But stuff like that. But also, yeah, there was some interesting background material. I really actually did enjoy the article in Astounding about calculating machines. I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah.
It's like, it was something that we spent a good amount of time talking about, even though it wasn't one of the fiction pieces in the magazine, because it was so interesting from a historical perspective. And looking at it now, 80 years, 90 years on, you know what I mean? It's just crazy. So, yeah. And interesting, too, I thought, was the fertility stuff, which I didn't really... That was a huge thing that I could have looked a lot more into, but I guess I kind of wanted to see a little bit, because we are talking about science fiction and we are speculating on the future, even though most of the stories we did were older ones, except, oddly enough, for the one that didn't talk about fertility much at all, which was The Children of Men. But generally, I guess, to see where we think we're going as a society with this. And it was really interesting I picked a book. I'm sure I could have seen many, many other perspectives, but it was interesting to go into and interesting to think about, and a little scary, almost, too. So I enjoyed looking into that material, and yeah. So that was pretty cool. And if anybody else has anything else to add, any other research or nonfiction notes that you guys want to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of the fertility episode. I'm really glad that we were able to cover Little Ember, which, of course, I wouldn't have found out if I had not been reading through the different backgrounds for Forster and came across that. And I think that's part of the reason why both that and Machine Stops, I like them even more as stories having done the research about Forster. I think that the specific book that Wendy Roberts did on him was a really fascinating read, and you get to see all the different connections that he had with certain literary figures of that time, especially reading some of the stuff with him and Virginia Woolf, and I don't think I mentioned it much when we were actually speaking about it in the podcast, but The Well of Loneliness, which is this lesbian novel that was pretty heavily... obviously criticized when it first came out. There was like this petition, and he was someone that was kind of like in the realm of that time when this controversy was taking place. And I thought that was just a really interesting sort of fact when looking into that topic.
Yeah. And while we're on the subject, it's kind of related, and I don't maybe I'll bring up, maybe the story will come up later, maybe not, but certainly one of my most fascinating. So it didn't make my top 5, so I'll bring it up now. But The Steel Husband was a really cool story. And it made me think that, it's such a shame that Anna Barkova, I guess, didn't flourish. Didn't really have a chance to flourish that much as a writer and become... Because she was really onto something with that.
Yeah.
Her background was definitely really interesting, too.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, a lot of the authors that we've covered have been really interesting people, even the by-the-numbers genre writers. The fact that people can crank out like 150 stories within the course of 5 years across all these like Western and science fiction and detective magazines is a pretty impressive feat on their own. Never mind people like Forster or Barkova, who had really fascinating lives and touched various literary figures of their day and everybody else. So, a lot of really cool rabbit holes. I think the figures like Forster, where we have the scholarly biographies, are really, really useful tools and fascinating to dig into. And the autobiographies are a really fascinating lens to look at these people from, just how they phrase and put their own life experiences in front of the reader, both from the Isaac Asimovs out there, who are the well-respected and influential sci-fi author, to more obscure figures like the Kardinalowska sisters.
Yeah. And while we're on the subject, I will also mention, before I forget, that probably one of the most, if not the most widely known popular author, maybe, aside from Wells, but probably even more so than him, that we've covered on the podcast was Mark Twain. And I basically skimmed through and read certain chapters from several biographies of Mark Twain. And so I definitely feel like I got more of an understanding of him as well. And his life and personality and stuff. Mark Twain's autobiography is a rambling, disjointed, not very put together mess. But, luckily, we have probably at least a dozen very high quality biographies of him written by scholars and so on of Mark Twain and his work. So it's a lot to...
I remember when we were covering Connecticut Yankee, I went to my university library just to see how many, just like 2 whole bookshelves of books on Twain, and obviously you're going to get that with someone as prominent as he is.
Yeah.
Forgot if I mentioned on the podcast, but I did go to the Mark Twain house in Hartford a little bit after we recorded that episode, and I got to see the Page Compositor, which was the elaborate machine for movable typeface that basically bankrupted him.
Oh yeah, but he was always putting things into all sorts of hopeless inventions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Things. Yeah, like that massive typewriting machine and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. I guess the last thing that I'd like to talk about, maybe briefly, before we get into the rankings of the stories, which is, I know what everybody's looking forward to, because those things are such fun, is music. So, Nate, you made some really cool interludes.
Oh, thank you.
During the past couple of years. Some of them were based on actual written music, like the polkas. Some of them used some cool sound effects, like we have recently, actually in our last episode, we had the teleport story by Mitchell.
The Man Without a Body.
Oh, the Man, yeah.
Yeah. That one has some couple really cool interludes, I think, where you made a really neat use of sound effects. But do you have any favorites? Do you have any interesting experiences from fucking with the vocoder and stuff?
Well, yeah, that was pretty fun to use.
Among other things.
Telephone switching sounds in Man Without a Body segment. Some of or pretty much all the music, I guess, I didn't mention this when we did the Soviet 1920s short stories episode, but all that was from a Princeton collection of, they call it a Slavic collection, though it's kind of a bit of a misnomer because there was one Georgian composer in there, but basically they made stuff from the Soviet Union, and all the stuff was dances and popular songs from that era, which was pretty fun to do. I think the popular songs are a nice touch, and especially compared with the more, polkas and shatishes and those dances that kind of sound the same after a while, even though a lot of them are kind of fun and silly sounding, especially with modern synthesizer sounds. But for a lot of the interludes, depends on what I'm feeling at the time when I wrote them. A lot of it is reflective of stuff I'd been listening to previously, so a couple interludes that I've done in the last couple of months have been like sparse bells with reverbs and stuff like that. I've been listening to Gamelin, Son of Lion, so that's where like a lot of that came into my head. Or stuff that's more like droney stuff will be, listen to like Bianchi or artists like that who, more industrial feedback-y type stuff. So it just kind of all depends on what's kind of going through my head at the time and what I want to shape to some of these stories. And some of them turn out pretty decently, I think, and setting the mood for what we're about to talk about. So you're definitely going to be continuing doing that in the episodes going forward, both in terms of original compositions and finding public domain sheet music out there in terms of the dances and popular songs and things like that, because I think those are a lot of fun.
I definitely enjoy those additions to the podcast. I think they're definitely good atmosphere setters.
Gives it a more unique touch, and this is stock music that you can pull from whatever Creative Commons license too. So
yeah, we do have some of that stuff up on a separate page, right?
Yeah, well, I stopped updating that. Just like another thing that I had updates, so that's kind of out of date. So I don't know. I might pull that or down, but yeah, I try to index the timestamps on our description stuff so you can kind of click around and
if you want to hear that, some of the older interludes, then definitely do that. But some of the new stuff is really cool, though. So definitely appreciated that. It's definitely a cool addition to the podcast. I do want to try doing a little more creative stuff too, like little fun skits, like the thing we did for Astounding, and stuff like that. If we can get it together to do more stuff like that, we certainly will, because that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, those are fun to do.
Cool. Yeah, the more we practice, too, the more we won't do things like accidentally run over each other's lines. Silly stuff like that. So, but yeah, it's fun to do stuff like that. So, and yeah, I mean, we are a fiction podcast, so we can have fun with it, and do stuff like that. And definitely, who knows what'll be coming in the future. I have a couple of small ideas, but I think it might be a little ways away yet. And I do think, like, sometimes it's just like we have so much to focus on, and our minds just are occupied with all this stuff, and we flit from one thing to another. It's like, Astounding, I think, was a really cool experience to actually go through an issue. I think that, I don't know that I want to do that for any specific other magazine, but stuff along those lines where we actually take things in a slightly different way, I would definitely not be opposed to, because that definitely inspires that sort of creativity as well. It's like, hey, we're reading a issue of Astounding from 1939, so what would it be like if we were in 1939, like reading this, right? And it was just like, so, yeah. And doing stuff with music and sound to accompany that also, of course, makes perfect sense. So, yeah, maybe more stuff like that, more readings, stuff like that. Maybe coming in the future. Stay tuned.
Yeah. No shortage of stuff I want to do, definitely, yeah. Huh.
All right. Well, speaking of that, why don't we take a quick break? And when we come back, we can run through our rankings of the stories.
Right. Sounds good.
Okay, so I have my die here, and I guess I'll be 1 and 2. Nate, you can be 3 and 4. Gretchen, 5, 6. Here we go. Let's see who gets to start. We're going to start with our least favorite, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay. So, 3 least favorite stories. I have a preamble for mine. I don't know how you guys are going to feel about it, but I had actually an easy time picking the stories relatively, but not order. And I'm also leaving out the fandom stories, because I don't really think it's fair. Like, they were probably the worst all around, but, like, I don't know. It just doesn't seem fair to judge a story written by the 15-year-old Jim Blish, you know what I mean? Say, oh yeah, that was really bad. Like,
my enjoyment of those was still higher than the 3 that I picked, so I did include those in my consideration list.
Okay.
Yeah, I think objectively maybe, but I don't know. I'm considering these from a subjective, how much did I enjoy these stories? And yes, 15-year-old Jim Blish and 14-year-old Sam Moskowitz I thought were very charming to read, him, even though they're clearly not masterpieces.
Yeah, and I felt the same way for the Trek, Star Trek. It was just, it's just like, they're just fun. I felt kind of bad. I feel like I'm picking on them, and it was just like, you can just see them like having an enthusiastic time.
Definitely,
yeah. Okay, I'm blowing on the dice. Yeah, here we go. Who gets to start? Okay, Gretchen, you get to start because I rolled a 6. So, what's your first negative reaction?
I will say that this was... Both lists were difficult for me to compile just because for the best stories, I think there were quite a lot that were really good that we've read since we last did a list, and several of them I had like an equal time really enjoying. I think that when it comes to that, the top 2 stories I am absolutely dead set on, but the other 3, take that with a grain of salt. I can change those into other ones that I felt equal enjoyment for. The worst was kind of hard just because I felt like some of the stories that I were ones that perhaps were forgettable more so than other ones. I didn't know if I should choose those or ones that I actually remembered not really caring for. So I chose the ones that I just remembered feeling a bit, either they they frustrated me because they disappointed me if they had potential, or just because they were a little longer and it felt like they were a bit of a slog to get through.
Yeah.
Number 3 is actually Erewhon by Samuel Butler, which I just felt was one of the longer works that we read, and I just didn't care much for a lot of the way that it progressed. So I went with that one. Overall, I think there were some aspects of it I really did enjoy, and I think there were some interesting concepts, but it did feel like a slog to get through at times.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a reason we don't do a lot of utopias on the podcast.
Yeah.
And I was kicking around the idea of doing like looking backwards or some of those other ones that were like really, really popular at the time, but at the same time it's like, do I really want to read like another one of these? And the answer is no, I don't.
Yeah, I wasn't around when I know you did like the feminist utopias and stuff like that. I am familiar with those, and I've read some others on my own, and they all feel very samey. As soon as you read one, you kind of read all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that we're on a roll of improvement. Like, I had this argument with people all the time who say that, generally speaking, things like TV and film are improving. It's an improving art form that just gets better over time. I don't think we as Chrononauts are necessarily, I mean, maybe we're getting better as podcasters, but I don't think we're necessarily just doing better material. But I do think, like, early on, in our early days of the podcast, even though we did some really, really awesome stuff like Frankenstein, and we did The Time Machine, we did some really good Poe and Verne and Nathaniel Hawthorne and lots of good stuff like that. There was definitely a couple times where we had to slog through things like that, and I don't really necessarily want to go back there that much, right? Like there's 19th century utopian polemics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can be tough. They can be interesting to discuss, though, and that was the best thing about doing Erewhon, was being able to talk about it. That was a really fun talk that we had for that episode. So I don't regret doing it, but it's also on my list. I was going to go next, so I might as well, because I'm not really fussing about order. I just kind of, sorry guys, but I just kind of just said screw the order, because I don't really know, right? I think we kind of got to
three-way tie for last.
Yeah, I mean, unless something, like, really, really stands out to me, I'm not going to be like, this is so much worse or so much better than everything else that we did, right? And it's like, everything has a different criterion, so I'm not really, like, for both least and most favorites, I'm picking short stories and novels, right? So, and, when you put those two things against each other, a lot of people would probably think, the novels are always going to come up on top. That's not always the case, right? And there's different criteria for all kinds of ways of looking at these things. So, I'm gonna just bring up Erewhon now because you did. And it's pretty much for exactly the reasons you said. It started out really cool. I enjoyed like the travel into the mysterious regions of what was it, New Zealand or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I enjoyed that part. But I mean, like, all the societies, the weird satire, the strange obsessions that Butler seemed to have with Handel and other, I don't know, like, something, I guess, about his parents, probably. Family. Didn't really get along well with his family, so. The machine stuff, obviously, was why most people would read this now, I think. And that's why we chose to add it to the podcast as well. And that was definitely, it was cool, but I mean, like, and it was really interesting that somebody like Frank Herbert, for example, obviously took a lot from this concept, but I definitely think he could have done more with that as well. But that doesn't seem to be like, this is the post-machine Erewhon we're living in now, and it's like, society the Erewhonians got over all that, so. And we get to learn about their legal system and their, I don't know. I mean, it definitely, there were parts where I was like waiting for the end of the chapter. One thing I did like was that each chapter kind of it was very compartmentalized. Like each chapter kind of dealt with a different thing. So if you were kind of bored during one chapter, you could wait for the next chapter to come along and it might pick up a little bit in interest.
Yeah.
And I liked the ending.
Yeah.
I remember that. So
yeah, I think the two parts that just for personal enjoyment I like, it's that send me more money and I'll keep writing is a really great way to end it. And I am still quite, I don't know if charmed is the right word, but I'm going to use it, with the image of just yelling at a baby and being mad that it was brought into the world. That was fun. And I think the machine, of course, like you said, that is kind of the reason people would read it. And I think that the concepts are interesting, but yeah, it was sometimes you were just waiting for the chapter to end.
Yeah. And Raywan is also on my list. I actually marked it in a lower slot than the one I picked next. But I think the reason I ranked Raywan a little bit lower is because, it is a long slog for most of it. And this other one, Nelson Bond, Lightship Ho, wasn't great, but it was a quick, short story that was over fairly quickly. So it never really became a slog, but I didn't really care for it. It was silly and ridiculous. And it's just kind of there.
Yep. So that's your first pick, Nick?
Yep.
Nice.
So I'm kind of curious at how much our bottom three line up with one another, because we all agreed on a Raywan, so I guess we'll see if Nelson Bond makes either of your bottom lists as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll respect the running order. I think we're actually picking a lot of the same stuff. But Gretchen, what's your next one then?
So my next one this is recency bias. This was just the one that I was thinking of that, I don't know, I guess thinking about it, I probably would have put this maybe a little less. It didn't bother me as much as Erewhon, so maybe I should have put this in number 3. But again, take this with a grain of salt, I guess. The Monster Maker by Morrow, just, again, looking at stories that had potential and just sort of disappointed me, is this one, because I think we all agree that the first part of the story is, like, really interesting.
Yeah.
And if it had just cut off, I think it still would have been a great story, but then it just lingers with that second part that really just disrupts the flow.
It was really strange. Yeah, I almost thought about that one too. I guess that would be a so-called dishonorable mention because, like the one of the most frustrating, and I do like your criteria a lot of basically saying, well, it's not just a bad story, it's the story that doesn't really live up to its potential because, that first half was really cool.
Yeah.
Some really chilling descriptions and just like, so much more could have gone on if he just kept up that narrative instead of introducing this other. It's just, I don't know.
That's the one I went with, just because I, again, wasted potential, and even if the story had continued, again, from, like, the wife's perspective, or we had gotten just a different introduction to that last part, I think it still would have worked.
Yeah, it was a real shame, because that was a reread for me, and for some reason I didn't remember. First of all, I didn't quite remember how awesome certain bits about the first half were, but I also didn't remember that it had shifted like that, like to, completely different later perspective, dropping all that, like halfway through the story. So it was kind of frustrating to reread it because I'm like, I remember this. This is cool. Wait. Okay. So, I don't know. Good pick. I don't know. I feel kind of like I was focusing a lot on the earlier ones that we did, and that, if I hadn't been, maybe I would have thought of that one too. It's definitely would be in my additional notes if I brought up additional stuff. But my second pick there would be indeed Lightship Ho by Nelson Bond, my favorite of all the American pulp writers. I didn't like it. It's trying to be funny. I don't know. I guess it wasn't like. Again, though, I mean, I guess I want to be kind of fair to it because, Bond, I don't know. He seems like he was an interesting enough person, and I'm sure, like, something he wrote is probably kind of good, but I'm like 3 for 3 now of not really enjoying anything that I've read by him. So I think that makes it worse in a lot of ways because I'm looking for that one thing. And he just keeps doing the humor that I don't like. It's not good humor. Like,
it's very corny humor.
So that bothers me. I mean, I guess I can forgive a lot of things and overlook a lot of things, but like just really awkward, bad humor that doesn't stop is something I have a really hard time with. It's no different whether it's now or 1939. Like, it's just always going to be like that. So, I guess, though, the fact that it's old does give it a certain charm. You know, it's just, like, weird. Weird stuff that you wouldn't... You know, like, there were a couple of things about the story that were neat. But, yeah, I didn't care for it. Not really a ton to say about it, though. So, I guess it's not a situation where I think, oh, there was so much potential to this. I could have used that criteria, but I guess I didn't use that so much this time. I mean, there were a couple of others that I thought about including where maybe that would be the case, but it seems like besides Erewhon, maybe my other two inclusions are all like, yeah, I just didn't like it very much. So, yeah, that's my second pick.
All right, yeah, my second slot I put in Erewhon. Yeah, I just mentioned this. Slog didn't need to be this long, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
We get through the not so goods quick. So that's fair. I think that's fair. My last pick might surprise you guys, but maybe not. You all still got one more too. So
the last one that I chose, and it's funny, Lightship Ho was definitely one that stuck out as one I would have put on this list, but I decided to go with the other one that was included in that round of stories, The Moth by Rockland.
Okay. Yeah. I figured that would be at least on you guys.
Yeah. When I was thinking again of the potential, Lightship Ho kind of, I don't know, I don't think it felt like it just could have been what it was, and there wasn't as much I could see being changed about that, but the fact that The Moth, I think, could have been better if they had utilized the female character in it better. The fact that, like, we have another story that could have been created from The Moth, where she is, like, a character that has, like, more agency and more potential in the story, and it just doesn't take that route, because why would it? You know, why would we have that happen? So that's what upset me about it.
It's never a good sign when the first thing you think about a story is, well, if this had been a completely different story focusing on this and that instead, that would have been good.
Yeah. If it had been a completely different story, I would have liked it a lot more.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. It didn't really make my list of the bottom three. I guess I didn't really mind it, but I don't think it was very good either, right? Yeah. But, like, you know, other stuff that I was going to include, like Creatures of the Light by Sophie Wenzel. I didn't really like that either, but I don't know. It was fun in its way. So I kind of thought, like, the Rockland had some fun future things, like weird fashion things that I thought were kind of amusing, and the writing style was sort of fun. So I don't know. I didn't mind it that much, but I don't disagree with you either. All right. Well, I guess this is a surprise then. I have a feeling, Nate, this won't be your other third pick either. But, and again, I'm not really paying that much attention to order. I'm not saying this is like the downright worst thing we read or anything like that. But it's Death of the Happy City from Elizabeta Kardinovskaya. She and her sister, you know, it's definitely one of these things that we looked into where, that aspect was really interesting and the background was really interesting and their story was quite moving and tragic. So it's a shame in a way that we covered this little science fiction story that Elizabeta wrote because, to me, this is not very good. This is like, I don't know, it's just weird, uncomfortable messaging. Definitely, like, okay, we all know that greed is bad, but, like, you're saying that, like, these poor innocent people, all it takes is for somebody to be like, hey, there's something in there that some other people you've never met think is very, very valuable, and why don't you just go out of your way to destroy your own village? And meanwhile, there's like the fallen civilization, like, they used to be so wise and powerful. They knew how to, they did all this cool stuff, like harness the power of the atom, but they're that naive, and there's like children that have to be looked after by a good, friendly communist state. I don't know. I didn't like it. Sorry. I don't think it was your translation, Nate. I think it's just, basically, I don't know from what I can tell, and from what you were saying in the biography, they didn't really do a lot of fiction per se.
No, there's only 3 stories in total from what I can tell. That's like the science fiction fantasy adjacent, and that one was by far the shortest, which maybe I shouldn't have chose it for that reason, because it doesn't really give you a good amount of space to work with.
Yeah.
So some people are really effective in doing like a 2,000 word story, but
Right.
I didn't really find too much troubling with the translation piece. A lot of the sentences were kind of terse in the original. So I don't know. Hopefully the translation reads okay, but it's definitely not one of the strongest stories we've covered, and the messaging is a little weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think its flaws are just the story itself. Like, I think that the translation seems like it was done well. So I think it was just how it was written and what they wanted to convey. And I will say, when I mentioned earlier about, being biased because I enjoyed looking at the authors, this was the story I was talking about. I didn't want to put this on there because I was considering it. I definitely was thinking of putting this on the list, but I did enjoy reading the biography, and I think that just turned me from putting it on the list.
Yeah, the autobiography was an absolutely fascinating read, and certainly anybody who's listening to this who is not interested in the story should definitely read that.
I mean, it definitely puts us in a weird position, right? Because the thing we're talking about is like not even a footnote in the biography, right? So I'm sure that's not what Elisabetta would have wanted to be known for either, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's good that we looked into that stuff, and I'm not like, I say this and I'm putting it on my list and everything, but it's like, I mean, it's so short. It's not without enjoyment to read, I guess. But I just didn't like the overall message of the story or what I thought it was. I didn't like the paternalism kind of thing that it seemed to be going for. It just didn't feel, I don't know, it didn't feel earned. Like, again, maybe if this had been more gone into, if she got more into the society and there'd been more depth to the story, it's possible that I would have liked it more, because I do really like some of these old, like, Lost Race kind of stories. I enjoy that stuff. I think it can be fun, even when it is sort of colonial or whatever. Like, I don't necessarily always mind that if the story's good enough, but there's just not enough meat on the bone. It was like a very short story, which works to its advantage because, if it's bad, you're not really going to hate it that much because you didn't spend that much time reading it. But also, like, whatever conclusions you draw from it are probably the conclusions that she wanted you to draw, because there's only so much text to put in there, and it's like, it's pretty plain in my view, even with the fact that it's translated and everything. It's just kind of like, I mean, I get what it's trying to say. It's not very subtle. It's not like you can sit here and...
I don't think it's going for nuance.
No.
Right.
As much as other stories could.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, that's my third pick, but, I don't know. I would still read it because, I mean, how often do you get to read a 1920s Soviet propaganda story that's never been translated into English before?
From Ukrainian.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah, so my bottom pick is also The Moth, so probably not a surprise there. I just thought this one was distasteful, poorly done, and like you said, if the one thing you're thinking of is this should be a totally different story, then it's probably not a good sign for the story. And I don't know, still with this in the Bond, they're fascinating snapshots, because even with the classic issues of Astounding that define the Golden Age, there's still these filler secondary stories in there that they probably have to run because they're running on a deadline. You have so many pages to fill, and the amount of really awesome stuff that Campbell was getting each month was probably not nearly as large as the slush pile of crap. So I guess you got to work with what you have.
And I don't think, like, it seems like Campbell and probably many other magazine editors of the time, they had their regulars, right? Who, I mean, they were not against courting new writers, but they had their regulars who would just deliver regular stuff, and they probably didn't have to, like, they knew that necessarily their stuff wouldn't require that much work, right? They wouldn't have to sit there revising them and telling them how they could make their stories better, which is something that Campbell always did, but I'm sure he saw some of these people as reliable old hands, and it was just like, okay, he can give us a story. I might have to do a little bit of work on it, but it'll probably be pretty passable pretty quickly, right? So it's just, kind
of a stable, steady flow that's needed.
And I think both Bond and Rockland wrote dozens of stories each across like several kinds of pulps. So yeah, they're probably just going through the motions, churning it out according to their formula that they've worked out over the years. Yeah, whatever sells, sells.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, let's do the best. I'll do another dice roll for us. I'll keep the numbers.
Yeah.
But all right, now, okay, I rolled a 2, which means that I get to start this time. So, all right, again, I'm not really fussing with order too much. I'm not saying that necessarily this is like the top 5 in order from least to greatest. I think that all of these are probably equally recommendable, depending on what you're looking for, right? And some of them are short and some of them are long. So again, like, it's not fair to quantify so much. This is just based on the way they feel, and they were all memorable in their own right. But yeah, the order is basically random. So, all right, so the first one that I'll bring up is actually Alas All Thinking by Harry Bates. I couldn't stop thinking about this story. It was really weird because I didn't really expect it to be like that, and I didn't expect it to be so haunting and kind of like staying with me for days and kind of making me feel like, I don't know, weirdly unhappy and tense, but like in a cool way, you know, like in a, oh, this story did something, it did something good to me, right, in a way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was really surprised by this, and then it's really funny because going into the history of Astounding and of the magazines and stuff, Bates was an editor not long before this story came out, and I read some of the early Harry Bates stories, and they're not very good. They're like they're very, very rote, very like kind of almost like typical pulp. Like he's not really trying, just kind of trying to knock out something and get the pages filled, right? There's not really a lot to recommend them. But then it's like all of a sudden he stopped being an editor. He took a backseat, and all of a sudden he's like, all right, maybe now I can just write the stories I want to write. And it's kind of the impression that I got. And it's so sad, too, because he didn't really get a lot of time to do that. And it seems like his hands really gave him a lot of trouble, and he was like in a lot of pain. And I think in the complete fiction of Harry Bates, there's all these like early stories from the late 20s and early 30s. And then you get Alas All Thinking and like 3 or 4 other stories from the late 30s. And then Farewell to the Master, which is like 1940. And that's the story The Day the Earth Stood Still is based on. And then like maybe 3 more from the 40s and early 50s. And that's it. And he was definitely developing into something really special. And I think that the really interesting thing about Alas All Thinking is if you can picture the story just being written like 5-10 years later, you feel like it would have been so different. But it just feels like it's on the cusp of something because like we're in a time when, yeah, like people are still thinking about eugenics and stuff like that. And the Nazis they're a thing already by this point, but they're not really like, most people aren't really aware of them. I would think, especially in the United States. And things like the atomic bomb haven't happened yet. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about The Brighton Monster by Kirsch, where basically a guy whose relatives died in the Holocaust, this writer is basically saying, this is the worst invention that humanity has ever come up with. Right? Like, it's just mind-blowing to think how the events of the Second World War changed the way people thought about things. And the fact that this story is on the cusp of that somehow makes it more potent rather than less. Because yes, it's before that point. And yes, like, the things that it presents you with are really uncomfortable if you spend a lot of time thinking about them. The way you did the summary, Gretchen, in our episode was really cool because it's so bleak. There's also humor in the story, which is really weird, too. Like, it's just like him trying to be, like, a crooner and stuff and trying to sing to her, and then she's like, wait, I think I feel something. Come back in 10 months, and then we'll see where we're at. Like, it's so funny. But, yeah, it was, like, a really powerful story. Strangely affecting. I don't know, just, like, really took me by surprise, because there wasn't really any other story like that in the early Astounding episode that we did. Closest maybe was like Old Faithful, which didn't quite make my list, but was a really cool story as well.
Yeah.
where it's like character driven, but also like the I don't know, the concepts were powerful. And this one left an impression. It never left me. That it just like really potent, I thought. So a big surprise with that story.
Yeah, this was number 3 on my top 5. I really enjoyed this story. And it was one that I did not expect to impact me as much as it did. I find myself thinking about it a lot more than I expected. And for the reasons that you had mentioned, JM, it's such a taking into account when it was created. And I think also that we happened to read it at the same time as Creatures of the Light, which does kind of tackle similar themes, which is another reason why I couldn't put Creatures of the Light in the worst, just because I think it worked really well reading it with this story and thinking about the two side by side, so I couldn't do that. But yeah, this one was on my list.
Yeah, this one didn't quite make my list. I think if we did a top 10, it definitely would have, but it was a really excellent story and definitely a highlight of the early Astounding days.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I would rank this above Who Goes There or not, but yeah, both those stories from that episode I think were both outstanding.
I think one of the reasons why I had to make it in my list was that it felt personally, I don't know, like I had a stake in it a little bit, and I was like, I think the reason I was bothered, but bothered in a cool way, was because of that, and I had to include it because you just don't expect that from a early 30s Astounding story necessarily, I think. So, yeah.
All right, so my pick for the number 5 slot is C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner's Vintage Season, which, yeah, another great one from Astounding. We covered it in a different episode focusing on time travel stuff. But yeah, Moore is just an incredible writer, and she's able to convey a lot of really awesome stuff from what might be seeming like minor detail-oriented things like fashion and smells and sensations and things like that. But the grim and bleak imagery towards the end of the story, I think, was really, really well done and made for a pretty powerful and moving story. And also provides a interesting look on just the time travel phenomenon in general and how the tourism industry might affect that and become, I guess, a leisurely playground for the rich.
That's on my list too. For the reasons that you said, like, I think that it's really cool too how it starts out very small scale. Like you don't really play their cards too early. Like at the beginning, I kind of feel like, oh, maybe I'm reading like a Richard Matheson story or something. Like, I think that it's this weird domestic situation, and you're like, oh, how's this, who are these strange people that have moved in and stuff? And it's like, and it's a story just expands outward in such a dramatic and cool way. And yeah, the way, this definitely does seem like a Moore trait, describing sensations and describing like the way things feel and stuff is just, it can be really, really powerful in her hands. But also, yeah, like the glimpses of the weird future media and the interesting relationships between the characters that's mostly hinted at, but really well done, I think. And yeah, I mean, and this whole idea that like these future people might be coming into all kinds of things and watching all kinds of momentous events, and they're able to interact with us, but they can never tell us anything, right? It's like that kind of going back to that idea that I had a while ago where if people were visiting from the future, we probably wouldn't like them, like we wouldn't like them because, yeah, right, like here's these people who are going to witness a great apocalyptic event, and they're not there to help anybody. They're not there to prevent it. They're not there to, they wouldn't want to because that would change their past, right? So their future would not come to pass if they took an active role in trying to change things. That's not what they're here for. If they're not here just to watch, they're here to try to make sure that whatever their future is will come to pass. So it's not a great situation for Mr. Wilson, or whatever his name was. And yeah, it's a really, really cool story. Definitely in my list as well.
Cool.
Yeah, I will say Vintage Season is also quite further down on my list. I really love that story as well. For the same reasons both of you were saying, I really do enjoy that aspect of seeing a time travel story from the perspective of someone who isn't a time traveler, but is just witnessing them. And the idea that people from the future dehumanize basically people from the past. They're seen as primitive, they're seen as like not really knowing what we know now, that progress always moves on. And that's what allows them, of course, the time travelers in Vintage Season to just come back and see this thing as like just a tourist attraction. Yeah. But yeah, I really do love that story. As for number 5 for me, it was really hard to choose. I had a couple that I was thinking of. I was thinking Steel Husband. I was thinking Old Faithful, like you mentioned, JM. But recency bias also struck my best list. And I went with Man Without a Body by Edward Page Mitchell, just because I love that final image so much. That last bit, I think about that a lot. I remember telling like several of my friends about it just because it's just such a striking moment, and it's so gleeful compared to the other stuff that we read in that episode. So that was my number 5.
Yeah, I like Mitchell a lot. I mean, he's done a lot of really great things, and that was a really fun one, and especially that final image, which was pretty much the perfect note, I think, to end the episode on.
Yes.
Yeah, very, very powerful, definitely. We're all pretty much on the same page with a lot of these, which is really interesting. I wonder if we're going to have an outlier like Karnalovskaya was for me, but I don't know. I do have to include and give a shout out to my man, Fritz Leiber, and his The Big Time. And I'm definitely highlighting The Big Time, but also No Great Magic. I think it's cheating a little bit, but the two stories do kind of fit together pretty well. And I kind of see them as being of a piece, almost. Although, I mean, I guess somebody could argue that any of the other stories could also be, but I definitely think those are the two main events of the Change War. So, yeah, love the style, love the way he inhabits his characters, but also the way he, like, throws you into a situation and just kind of, like, over time starts explaining it through the point of view of his characters. And it's very naturalistic, and it feels, I don't know, it feels really cool. It makes the work worth multiple reads, I think. And definitely The Big Time is something you can come back to a few times in your life and just feel like, all the times that I've read it, I felt a little bit different about it. And I'm going to say that about something that I'm going to mention in a little bit as well, where it's like, yeah, there's just something different each time you read it, depending on how you're feeling and also what you know about the story at first. Like, I think the first time I read it, because I didn't have any idea what was really going on, I was a little lost. Not like in a really, really terrible, oh no, I don't know what's going on, I hate this way, but like, you know, I don't really, like, I'm not piecing it all together in my head yet. But it's okay. Like, I'm not minding that, and I'm piecing it together as he's telling it. And by the end, I think that I got it pretty well, but I knew, all right, I'll read this again one day, and it'll be probably even better because I'll already have some ideas about how this thing goes. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. No Great Magic is really cool because it's like, if Big Time is like the theatrical stage play, No Great Magic is like the meta story that's about a theatrical stage, you know, like performance. And it's like really, really, I don't know. It's cool in the way that it has that meta approach, but it's also like, it feels, you know, like it's drawing from Fritz's own experience in the theater. And one thing that Judith Merrill and others said about Fritz Leiber is that they pretty much said, and when you listen to him, you can go on YouTube and you can listen to some interviews of him from the 70s, especially on the radio and stuff. And I think there's a couple of recordings from conventions and whatnot. The way that he writes is the way that he talks. Really slow, methodical, thoughtful, emotional, kind of weirdly, I don't know, like you can see his personal things in all of his stories, both positive and negative, right? Like, you know, you can see the love of the theater, the love of Shakespeare in particular. You can see the chess. You can see the interesting sexual interactions, but there's a dark side to that as well. A little bit of sadomasochism and stuff. And there's also like some real alcoholism on display. He's very honest about that, and it seems very real, especially when you read something like Our Lady of Darkness, which is so like autobiographical, talking about basically blacking out for an entire year of his life. Real honest for that kind of thing. Like, this is a one-of-a-kind writer from the Golden Age period who worked in different genres as well as science fiction. So, if anything, he might even be more known for his horror and fantasy stories. So, love Fritz Leiber. Really glad that we got a chance to do that. I mean, it had to be on my list. It was my very familiar host choice that I'm like, yeah, I already know this stuff well, and I want to choose it. So, yeah, it has to be on the list for me.
Yeah, it was definitely a cool reading experience in that we got to read more of a series type thing without having to do 15 different novels. So, yeah, it was an interesting universe to explore for sure. But I think my next slot is going to be something a fair amount older from the page compositor himself, Mark Twain, and Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Certainly one of the most cutting American satirical novels ever written, and a very fun time travel romp on top of that. So we definitely had a lot of fun when we covered that one. I think it's by far the longest we've dedicated to any particular story. There's a lot to get into with that, and Twain's firing on all cylinders and really touches all the bases for me with the cutting humor, the science fiction imagery, the play on mythology and literature. Yeah, Twain's a master.
Is that one on your list, Gretchen?
I was very deeply considering it, but the only reason I didn't is because I have 2 other time travel stories we covered in that chunk, and I thought I'd try to do a little more variety, and that was the only reason I didn't have it on here.
Okay. It's definitely on my list because, this is pretty much the first, I guess, real adult novel I ever read, pretty much. It was read to me, and I was way too young to appreciate it, and I talked about all this when we were doing the podcast, but I've read Connecticut Yankee, I think, 4 times now, and always something a little different depending on where you're at in your life, I think, and I don't know, but definitely not really an Arthurian scholar, so maybe some of the references still a little bit go over my head, but not that much. I think now, especially, I don't think he was really, I don't think he's kind of coming at it from a place of lampooning the traditions, I guess, and he's not really, taking it very seriously, so I think it's all right to just have fun with it. We did have a lot of fun with it, and he did too, although it turns surprisingly dark by the end. But, really interesting work, a lot to get into, because, it just seems even now like reading some of because in the preparation for this, going into the background material and everything, it just seems like even now, people can't really necessarily agree on what he was trying to say, right? So, you get people who are like, oh, yeah, we're supposed to be on the Yankee side the entire time. And there's people who are like, no, man, he's an asshole. And it's just like, what are you talking about? And then there are people like, oh, Twain, though. Twain would have totally been on the Yankee side. It's like, yeah, but I don't know, man. He's just running roughshod over everything. And then maybe that's it. Like, the conflict is part of what makes it interesting. It's like, that's often what it is with art, right? Is there's some conflict in the mind of the creator that they're trying to exercise. That conflict is what makes the story, and that's what makes the story the conflict between tradition and, I guess, the up-and-coming new ways of science and technology and so on. And in Twain's head, it's like chivalry. What's good about chivalry? Well, there might be a few good things about it, but mostly it's hot and uncomfortable and sexist and, bad, right? But I don't know. Even in the end, we're supposed to feel like, yeah, maybe there's a certain amount of romanticism towards it, even that he can't escape. And it was cool. It was interesting, too. It was really bad, but it was interesting seeing the movie with Bing Crosby. We always like to watch the films, or at least try and watch film versions of the stories that we cover, just so we can talk about them. It was definitely the worst of all the film adaptations. But it was just really interesting, again, because it was like, okay, here's some 1950s Hollywood studio, and here's what they think of this, right? Like, this is the conclusion that they draw. Okay, right? Like, this is... The 30s one was, I guess, that was more in line with the... not really, no. It was pretty wacky. It was pretty wacky. I don't know. The 30s one was incomprehensibly... I don't know, just, yeah. It's kind of nonsense, but it didn't take itself very seriously, I guess. It was fine. But the 50s one it felt more like this is a manifestation of its time, and so, but really interesting work by Mark Twain. again, like you were saying, Nate, I don't know that we're going to come back to him on the podcast. Maybe we could talk about The Mysterious Stranger sometime, because it's weird and cool, but I don't know if it's really sci-fi. Oh, yeah, but we do have those telephone stories. Yeah. So we might, it's possible. It's possible. We have a couple more in background, so they may come up. We have some plans like that are kind of strictly laid out for the future, but a lot of the time we just have huge lists of stories that exist on our hard drives that we just kind of look at and we're like, yeah, can we fit the story in somewhere, right? So we kind of do things a little bit like that too. So, and we do have a couple of other short Twain ones, so it is possible.
Yeah, as I said, it almost made it on the list, and it was just me being arbitrary that led to it not being there. But for my fourth pick, I do think that the Liber Stories, the Change War series, works very well. It has like a very nice cumulative effect, but I did want to be fair and chose just one, and that is No Great Magic, because I know that you mentioned, JM, that it feels more like the meta commentary on like a theatrical play, where the first one is a theatrical play, and that is something I've always enjoyed. That's why I love Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead a little bit more than Hamlet. I really do like that aspect, and I love the Shakespeare references. I love Macbeth. I think it's just a really great setup, because of course, when you're launched into the big time and you don't know anything about what's happening until Greta is explaining things to you. So when you get to the sequel, you think you may have things figured out, and it's just complete disorientation again. And I really like getting, for a second time, completely thrown off by the narrative and figuring out what's going on. I really like the setting of it. I like the concept just a little bit more than the big time. So that is why I chose that one out of the Liber Stories.
Cool. Yeah, I won't argue with any of that. I mean, it's true. I guess in my head, I have a hard time separating them. But I can't say why I don't really necessarily feel that way about the other ones, because some of them did have, what's his name, showed up in the...
Oh, yeah. Night to Move.
The chess story, but I don't necessarily...
The Playboy one. Yeah.
Right. So I do think, like, well, I guess because Greta is she's the first person narrator of both. And it does feel like, even though she's lost a part of herself, maybe in both stories, though, in both The Big Time and No Great Magic, like, there's something, like, she talks about that in The Big Time. She talks about she's not sure who she really is anymore, like, how much maybe is gone that she doesn't know about, right? And No Great Magic is like, okay, here's something that's gone, or maybe something that's new. We're not sure, right? Like, it's not like there's a right version and a wrong version, right? So it's like they both represent the recuperation station in some way in the Change War, right? But there's just very different ways of looking at it. And she doesn't remember any of the details of where she's been and the war that she's kind of on the sidelines of in No Great Magic, but it's still operating there in the background just as much. So I'm glad that was on your list. That's really cool. I guess I only have one more, and I guess it's probably things have kind of fallen into place in an interesting way. But I saved this for last, not because I was necessarily going to put it last, but because nobody else has talked about it yet and had the first dice roll. So it's the other Butler, Octavia Butler, and Kindred. And it has to be on the list because, I mean, again, a very powerful work. So tight. And so, like, it's amazing to me how she packed so much into what was really not a very long book. And she didn't waste anything. She didn't waste any words. She didn't waste any time. I wish that the TV series had... I don't know. I wish it had just been a movie. Okay, that's what it is. That's what it really comes down to. They could have done justice to it. But anyway, just so confronting and powerful, and like, again, like some of the other works, especially Alas All Thinking, I think, is it leaves you thinking, and possibly how many different ways can you interpret this? Like looking at, and even like I did look into some of the background here too, because the way we handled that one, we all kind of just split things and talked about different aspects of it. Like, it was a little different for us, I think, the way we handled it. And it was good. It worked out pretty well. But reading some of that stuff, I think, it, again, brought home to me that, not everybody thinks the same about this book, right? Like, they kind of feel very differently about it, right? And there's no consensus. And that's okay. That's good, right? That makes it more interesting. So, again, we have that, again, with Yankee as well, where it's like, there's so much more to this. Somebody could come away feeling something completely different. And I'm going to bring up something tangential when we talk about Frederick Pohl in a couple of weeks that I thought was really interesting, where a story of his came up and somebody said something about it to me in an online group. And I read the story because it's very short. And the way I felt about it seems to be completely 100% different than the way they felt about it. So I think the interesting thing, too, about some of the stories that we choose and the fact that we're doing a genre like science fiction is, all right, maybe basic pulp stories, like even really good ones like Who Goes There by Campbell, right? Like, I don't know that they necessarily leave themselves open to interpretation in the way that some of these other works do. But science fiction can do that, for sure, because, the future is such a nebulous and frightening concept, and something like Kindred doesn't deal with the future, but in a way it does, and some of the, I guess, scholarly work around it talks about that, too, is that, it's also not just going into the past when slavery was still around and stuff in the United States, it's, like, also commenting on the now and what's to come. So many elements that people seem to be arguing about, like, how are we supposed to view Kevin in the story? Like, is he a friend, or is he really an ally, or is he not? It seemed like we were all in agreement that he was, but, like, some of the feminist interpretations were like, no, he's terrible. He's, like, stopping her at every turn and undermining her and stuff like that. And it was just really interesting the way so many people have different ways of looking at this. And talking about things like Rufus, and how when he's a child, he's relatively blameless. He's part of the society, and maybe she thinks she could possibly change him and help him and stuff like that. And to see him basically fall into the same traps that his father fell into, and, like, it's beyond anybody's ability to help. And then he becomes so threatening, and at the same time, he's, like, very human, right? I don't know. It's just debate that you see it sometimes in political circles where it's like people look at the opposing side, let's say Nazis, for example, like extreme right-wing type people, and it's like, you shouldn't go out of your way to humanize them or something like that. And to me, it's like, whoa, why wouldn't you? That's what makes it scary, right? Like, that's what makes it scary, because they can live a normal life and they can be cool and happy and funny one minute, and the next minute they're, like, plotting genocide. It's like, you have to be able to square that up somehow. And yes, the fact that people who did such terrible things are very, very human is exactly what makes it scary. So, I don't know. This is a really powerful work. I read it very quickly, and then I wanted to, I basically read it a second time because I wanted to, obviously talk about it on the podcast and summarize it and everything. And I was kind of thinking, okay, how do we approach this, right? And I don't know. Sometimes, really difficult books that have a lot of trauma and stuff in them, they take me a long time to read. This one didn't, though. I guess she even said she held back a little bit from making it quite as terrible and graphic as she could. And I guess maybe that's part of the reason. I don't know. But, it was also just a really good book because I just wanted to see what would happen and how she would deal with it, and, whether she and Kevin would be able to return to the present and be happy, or whether something terrible would happen, or whether, how long is she going to keep getting called back like this. So, I just definitely enjoyed it a lot, despite the heavy subject matter.
Cool, yeah, that was higher on my list, but in the, third slot, I put E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, which that was just a total masterpiece, amazing atmosphere, really cool world that he sets up, as well as the commentary on the interpersonal relationships that we have with one another, and how technology can possibly affect that in the future. There's a lot of stuff that he really crams in here very, very early on. And, we talked about Little Ember later on, but I think it's just a bit of a shame that he didn't write more science fiction stuff in this vein because he's really incredibly good at it.
Yeah, those two, both Machine Stops and Little Ember, it was very hard not to put those, try to find a place to put those on the list, just because Machine Stops, of course, is, like you said, it is a masterpiece, and has so many different themes that remain very prevalent that really are displayed so well, in a similar case with Butler and Kindred, that are tackled in such a short and compact span of time and of writing. Yeah. And Little Ember is just really fun. Yeah. It's just a really fun story. Yeah. And also just really interesting to cover queer topics in a way that we, of course, haven't had a chance yet to do on the podcast as much, just because of the time periods we've been working in. But yeah, I really enjoyed those stories as well.
Yeah, but, there is that bibliography floating around, which I haven't found republished anywhere. It's like buried in a couple archives and special collections somewhere that I don't know who put it together, but it wound up in Ackerman's hands. So I don't know. I do want to take a look at that and see what else is on the list, because it's themes that are definitely suppressed and possibly didn't make it past the censors in some cases. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what's out there as far as queer themes in science fiction go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, if I had honorable mentions, because I did name 5 there, but I think the Machine Stops would definitely be up there. Mm-hmm. It was very, very, very immense, powerfully written. And I think the fact that I read it for the first time in 2020, when we were all isolating and everything by force, and it was it just felt it hit me at that time.
Yeah.
I think on the second reading, I kind of started to notice a little more of the, I'm not sure, there's a little bit of the kind of technology is bad. There didn't seem to be, don't get me wrong, the story is beautifully written and it has a powerful message about isolation and it has, amazing atmosphere, yeah, definitely. But I do think, I don't know, maybe the overall message of the story feels slightly simplistic, but I don't know. I don't necessarily mind that. I don't think that that's a mark against it, but it might have kept it out of the top 5, despite the fact that it's probably one of the best written stories that we've had on the podcast. I would say.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not really holding that against it. It's certainly nowhere near the bottom 3 or anything. But it just, I didn't quite make it because I think, on a second reading, I did find it a little bit I don't know, but at the same time, that brought home the ahead of its time aspects of the story, because I feel like we didn't really see too much of that till the 50s even. So yeah, in a sense, the story feels 4 decades ahead of its time, which is pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? So yeah.
I already had mentioned that my third spot was Alas All Thinking, and since we have covered the others that I've chosen, I will just say them now. Second was Vintage Season, and number 1 is Kindred. That was the one I chose as my favorite, which I guess makes sense, as that was the host's choice, and it still remains not just one of my favorite science fiction novels, but one of my favorite novels in general. I think it just really tackled themes of history and of trauma, and how complicit we are in those things in really interesting ways. And like you had mentioned, JM, in, again, really compact prose. It doesn't waste its time. It gets its message across in a way that feels very, very economic. And I love Octavia E. Butler in general, but Kindred is my favorite of all of her work that I've read so far.
Yeah, I mentioned the family bookshop in DeLand, Florida earlier. I bought Parable of the Sower there, so
nice.
Definitely looking forward to reading that at some point.
Yeah, Parable of the Sower is also a really good novel.
Yeah, definitely something to cover. Absolutely. Yeah. Those were other honorable kind of mentions for me. I guess I'd like to throw out a word for Moreau, because, Wells is just really good. Didn't make my list, but he's made a couple of the other ones from the past, so we read a lot of good stuff this time. Yeah. I think that in general, the reason it's just a bit of a struggle is, I think that even when some of the stories were maybe not that great, we had a lot to talk about. And in one case, we were talking about a whole magazine issue that was a part of history, right? So, we got to talk about Nelson Bond and Ross Rocklin and those guys, but they're part of the history too, and it's kind of fun to trash talk an author every now and then. So, I don't know. But at the end of the day, it was still interesting to do and still interesting to talk about. And I think, again, it's a lot easier to criticize in a fun way a short story that's 20 pages long as opposed to a 500-page novel that you hated slogging every page through. It's just terrible experience, and you have nothing good to say about it, right? It's just we hopefully will not end up in that situation. So, I don't know. It's possible, but let's hope not, right?
Yeah,
but
I'd like to avoid it for sure. Yeah. Yeah, so like I said, my number 2 slot was Kindred. And I think I had in my number 1 slot one that you guys didn't mention, which was Harry Martinson's Aniara, which I just absolutely love from start to finish. I love the way he plays with language. I love just how weird it gets with all the religious cult stuff and the bleak atmosphere and imagery of drifting through space endlessly and endlessly. I thought was incredibly, incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did really enjoy Aniara as well. But I will say that as much as I enjoyed it, I still lean more towards prose, which is probably the only reason that it wouldn't have made it as far as some of the others, but I think it is a great epic.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. That was an interesting one. And then one of them was fun to talk about. It didn't necessarily make my list either, because there were certain factors that were maybe holding it back a little bit, but I really enjoyed talking about When the Half-Gods Go from that issue as well. So there was an undiscovered gem, I guess, in a way. I mean, it's nobody really talks about Amelia Reynolds Long now, and I just thought it was really interesting, too, that in that 1939 John Campbell edited issue of Astounding, with Isaac Asimov and Van Vogt making their debuts, both of which were quite strong, I might add. The 2 stories written by women ended up being our favorites, pretty much all across the board.
Yeah.
So, it was kind of fun.
Yeah. You can't beat more.
No, you definitely can't. And I'm definitely looking forward to doing more of her stuff in the future, and I think we'll be returning to her sooner rather than later. But that is one of the fun things about this podcast, is finding those obscure authors that I'd never heard of before, and then just reading one of their stories and being totally blown away by it.
Right.
Yeah, it makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely be getting to more sooner rather than later. She's coming up in the Sword and Planet episode, and I'd like to get in her story, No Woman Born, at some point as well. It could have actually gone in really well with the medical episode, but, we're going to do a similarly themed episode again at some point. So, these things will be coming. They will be coming. And along with a lot of new authors, I have a couple of post-choice in mind for longer works that I would pick. So, a couple of novels from the 1930s, one being War with the Newts by Chapek, and the other being The Starmaker by Olaf Stapleton. So, 2 authors that we've featured before on the podcast, doing, in Chapek's case, something very different, because it's not a play. I actually think that as important and seminal as RUR is, and it was fun to read on the podcast as well, it was good to do. But I think War of the Newts is probably a better novel than RUR is a play. So, it'll be really, really cool to talk about that. It is definitely weird and definitely eccentric with a lot of cool personality to it. So, Starmaker is just wild. Starmaker is totally, when people talk about things being Stapledonian, they don't mean Sirius, I thought was really cool. It made my top 5 last time, but Stapleton is kind of known for these cosmic visions, right? Where you start out with a person or something close to now and expand out to encompass the entire universe of strangeness. And this is the kind of thing that set Arthur C. Clarke on fire in his mind that made him like envision all these like cosmos spanning science fiction stories. So yeah, and I know you guys have had some really cool ideas for future host choice ones. I know we've been talking about Roadside Picnic by the Strugatskys. We'll be doing that at some point for sure as well. And Nate, you had a couple of other ideas, I think. I can't remember what you had. You had some longer work that you highlighted.
Yeah, I'm not sure now. There's certainly a lot of stuff I really want to cover in the future. That's longer works that maybe more obscure. There's a French Sword and Planet Vampires of Mars novel that sounds really awesome.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of short stories that sound really cool from, Germany, Russia, Italy, places like that. Yeah, I think we have a lot of really cool stuff coming up, and definitely no shortage of interesting stuff to be covering going forward now that we're, well into the golden age, and, we'll be looking at stuff outside of the US and the UK as well. So I think it'll be our similar broad coverage of science fiction trends across the globe as we continue to move forward in time. So yeah, a lot of stuff to look forward to, I think.
And speaking of which, I didn't mention Anira. It's not in my list either, but yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting one as well that I did want to just kind of bring up again a little bit because, yeah, it seems to be something of an unsung work in the science fiction field, at least. Like, it never gets talked about, right? Probably because it comes from such an outsider, right? I found it a little bit, I don't know, like, it was a little hard to form a narrative out of, but I really enjoyed the pieces of it. Like, I enjoyed the personality of it, the different poems focusing on different aspects of the Andirans and their lives and their pasts and so on, and like, it was a really original work, definitely.
Yeah.
One professor at my university wants to introduce some science fiction into a course next semester and asked me if I had any recommendations.
Oh,
and
nice.
Among them, I was thinking of recommending Aniara because I think it just is something that is so unique to look at. I think it would be a very interesting piece to look at in a class.
Absolutely, yeah. And that intersection between, I guess, so-called highbrow writing of the Nobel Prize laureate set of authors and genre fiction is always a interesting piece when they come together, because it doesn't really happen that often.
They come together a lot in a lot of ways that people don't necessarily realize, right? You get like E.M. Forster writing a really cool science fiction story that's just out of the blue, right? Just like, oh, wow, where'd this come from?
And I feel like on the podcast we've covered just as many, if not more, Nobel laureates who have won prizes in fields outside of literature, like Ronald Ross.
Well, I do want to talk about Doris Lessing at some point.
Yeah.
So she's also a Nobel Prize winner, I believe. So I don't know how we're going to tackle her because most of her science fiction stuff is in this multi-volume series. So far, we haven't done any series on the podcast, and I have no idea how to approach doing something like that. That's like the bread and butter of genre fiction nowadays is series, right? Like, if you don't have a 12-volume epic plan, what the hell are you doing with your writing life, right? Basically.
Yeah.
I don't know how we're going to handle that. I would like to maybe talk about a few at some point in the future, but like that's so much reading that I don't really know. It's something we could plan like months in advance and just like read all as much of the works as possible, or decide on a cutoff point, like the Dune series, for example. Like, where do you stop with Dune? I don't know. I personally think you could stop after the second book, but you have to read the second book if you read the first book.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's the end of Paul Atreides' story, right? Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
And Jack Vance, The Demon Princes. I'd love to do that. That's like 5 books, but they're all pretty short. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a lot. So, but that is the bread and butter of modern genre writing. So we might have to address it at some point.
No, I think we will. And I think one of the publication themed episodes that we focus on will probably be taking a look at the industry shift to paperback novels, and then how that plays into these long novel series, because we could definitely see some novel series starting to emerge in the 50s and the 60s and things like that. I mean, some of them start as like fix-up novels like Foundation, So, I mean, there's technically not really 3 novels. It's kind of a bunch of short stories and novellas smushed into 3 novels.
Right.
But, I mean, you can see the beginnings of all that there. And I think we'll have to do it strategically because, yes, I don't want to read 20 novels for a single episode. But I think we could find maybe...
I would never make you guys read 20 novels in a series.
But, yeah, I think we can find some way to approach that topic.
How far did you get in the Expanse novels, by the way, Nate?
I read the first 3. I'd like to read the others because the show stops after 6. There's 9 in total, and I know it like does come to an ending point, so it's not like the author's just like writing endlessly for something that'll never come, like some of these other series authors do. So I don't know. They're despite the fact that they're not like short novels, they're also really quick novels. So I'll probably read the others at some point.
They seem pretty long.
Oh, they are, yeah. I mean, like, a lot of modern novels are in that 150, 175,000 word range.
Yeah.
And I think those are definitely, like, all that long.
They're not necessarily a difficult read, just a lot of pages.
Yeah, and again, I think that's how industry trends have shifted over time. I think the average genre fiction novel that comes out is in the 150, 175,000 word range, whereas, like, that's definitely the upper bound of stuff that we've covered on the podcast. I mean, we were talking about how long a Raywan was. I think that was only like 90,000 words or something like that. I think we've rarely hit novels that go 150,000 words, and I don't think we've only gone beyond that maybe like once or twice.
We'll definitely do that again. I mean, this format allows us a little bit of flexibility, so if we ever want to do something longer, we can probably do that, right? It's just like we have to pick, decide on the background and who's doing the background and where we're going with it, and we should be able to do. Eventually, we'll get there. We won't be doing The Wheel of Time or Malazan Book of the Fallen or anything like that on the podcast. Those are fantasy works anyway, so yeah. But something like Dune or The Demon Princess would be my pet pick because it's like some of my favorite Jack Vance work, and I'm still kind of vacillating on how and when to get him on the podcast, although I did mention The Languages of Power earlier for a linguistics theme episode, which will be cool, especially as it's based on a linguistics theory that apparently is not very well respected anymore. But it was written in the 1950s, so that happens, right?
Yeah, and that's always fun to dig into. How did people think about this at the time, and how has their thinking changed? Or in some cases, how has our thinking not changed?
Exactly, yeah. And that's, I think, part of the reason why it'll be an interesting first work to cover chronologically of that series when we get there. So sometime next year, probably early next year, we'll be doing that. But yeah.
Yeah, so I think in a week or two, we'll be returning to our regularly scheduled programming. We announce the stories that we're going to be covering next time, and in a week or two, you can expect the first of those to start posting, which will be Kailash Chunder Dutt's A Journal of 48 Hours in the year 1945. The earliest piece of fiction that you could remotely consider speculative fiction from India. So we're going to take a look at how science fiction developed in India during the colonial era, then after the independence era and into the modern day, and what science fiction is available to read in English. It's quite an interesting journey, and there's a lot of sources to get into, and it's definitely been my rabbit hole for this episode. And we'll also be talking about Sakio Komatsu's The Savage Mouth, which again will provide us an opportunity to talk about Japanese science fiction and how that developed after World War II. I think in the future we're going to be taking a look at a lot more both Indian and Japanese science fiction as the years go forward in time and we have more stuff available to us in English, as we do want to keep a broader global net of science fiction as we go more into the Golden Age and New Wave era and into the modern era. I think there's going to be a lot of cool stuff to talk about next time. And yeah, I'm looking forward to doing that.
We've all picked a bunch of stories, and not so much the Journal of 1945, but it sort of happened that most of the stories that we picked kind of do have a pretty firm horror aesthetic to them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
quite
interesting.
a few of them are really bleak. I made the mistake of reading several of them in one sitting on like I was waiting on campus for one class, and afterwards I'm like, man, I don't know if I feel like going to class anymore.
Yeah.
I was quite a downer.
But they're all good downer stories. I think if we were to rank our top 5 after next episode, I might have to rethink, because some of the stuff we're covering next time is some really, really excellent stuff. It's disturbing excellent stuff, but I think if you have listened to our podcast this far, we like a lot of the weird fiction. We like a lot of the horror stuff. So it's going to tie right in there with a lot of stuff we covered in the past.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it'll be interesting when we've finished with our 6 picks. If we have a general discussion based around how we feel about them and which stories we found most disturbing. Because, actually, really, all the stories are pretty disturbing. Even, in its way, the Journal of 1945 is pretty dark.
Yeah,
so
it definitely is very dark,
yeah. All right, looking forward to that. And you should be able to hear that episode pretty soon, the next couple of weeks probably. So, but for now, this is Chrononauts. This has been really fun. Really love the way our discussion of our least favorites. Yeah, we didn't really trash talk too much. We just got through it. And that's kind of, I think, how it was feeling this time around was like, most of the stuff was good. And, there's a lot of things that, like, could have been on somebody's list. And I would have totally understood if they were. They weren't on mine, maybe just because of familiarity or because of, like, stuff like Who Goes There and Black Destroyer. Like, it's good. It's all good stuff, really. And we didn't read a lot of bad stuff over the last couple of years. So, well done, guys. No bad stuff. Not much, anyway.
Yeah. Certainly looking forward to the next 60, 75 stories or however long it is between this one and the next one. And, I think we're going to be covering a lot of really awesome stuff in the future, too. So, fingers crossed that nothing is too bad.
Yes.
Yeah. And looking forward to the rest of 2024 and next year. A lot of really cool plans. So, stay tuned. This is Chrononauts. We've enjoyed doing this, and we'll be back very soon. Good night.